be quiet.
Right. Okay. We'll give him a few minutes.
I think this is queued up.
I think we did cue.
Yeah, whoa, it's got dark. There we go.
Welcome, and thanks for coming to this on a Friday afternoon. The afternoon is going to look something like this. Mr. Carl and I will talk exhaustively about a couple of scenes, and then Mr. McDonald will reflect upon one important aspect of this film. And this will take anywhere between 60 and 90 minutes, depending on how enthusiastic we get about details. Okay. It could take several hours, so be prepared. After this, there'll be a 10-minute break, and then we reconvene here for open discussion. And this discussion can then continue downstairs in the dining hall if we find ourselves unable to stop. So around 5:45, 5:30, 5:45, like that. We'll play it by ear and see how it goes. If we're perfectly comfortable here, then we'll stay here. To begin with, I'm going to read a quotation from an essay by Martin Scorsese, published in the August edition of the New York Review of Books. The essay is called The Persisting Vision, Reading the Language of Cinema. And it's a wonderful little piece that should be read by anyone interested in film. It's free online, so go to New York Review of Books and look up Martin Scorsese. Now, Scorsese says in his impassioned conclusion, I'm going to read a long quote, "We are face to face with images all the time in a way that we never have been before. And that's why I believe we need to stress visual literacy in our schools. Young people need to understand that not all images are there to be consumed like fast food and then forgotten. We need to educate them to understand the difference between moving images that engage their humanity and their intelligence and moving images that are just selling them something." As Steve Apcon, the film producer and founder of the Jacob Burns Film Center in Pleasantville, New York, points out in his new book, The Age of the Image, the distinction between verbal and visual literacy needs to be done away with, along with the tired old arguments about the word and the image and which is more important. They're both important. They're both fundamental. Both take us back to the core of who we are. When you look at ancient writing, words and images are almost indistinguishable. In fact, words are images. They're symbols. Written Chinese and Japanese still seem like pictographic languages. And at a certain point, exactly when is unfathomable, words and images diverged, like two rivers or two different paths to understanding. In the end, there really is only literacy. End quote. So there is only literacy. In our project this afternoon, our aim is to become a little more literate in our viewing of film, or at least of one film. But what is it to become more literate? When I first came to St. John's, I thought I knew how to read. But within a few months of being here, I found myself seeing more in a page than I had ever seen before. Different levels, lots of nuances. I realized that I hadn't really been reading before. One alumnus described this as learning to read with finer resolution, which I found is a great phrase. Seeing more things on a page, seeing with greater clarity, seeing with greater depth perception. But we don't acquire this finer resolution overnight. It is a process involving years of close study, especially the kind of detailed work we do in tutorials, scrutinizing every word and every step in an argument. We slow down enough to look with attention, and when we become acquainted with all the different kinds of things to see that we never saw before, we start to be able to see them even when moving at a more normal pace. In this way, the work we put into tutorials serves the faster reading of seminar. However, with the dominant artistic medium of our times, the moving image, we rarely have the chance to slow down and see all the things that are there to see in a given film. Our training as consumers is to hog down the present offering and rush to the next one. The films we watch may be high definition, but we do not watch with high definition. It is with the goal of cultivating this higher definition, this finer resolution, that we conceived a film institute in which we can learn to savor a film and become more attentive watchers, treating the great masterpieces of cinema with as much respect as we treat the books on our program. It's our experience that the great films can sustain and reward intelligent scrutiny as much as the great books can. And this afternoon, we hope that one of the greatest American films will open up to us and yield its treasures. In what follows, we're going to slow down our watching of the film with the aim of seeing what there is to see. Let's begin at the beginning. Now, do you remember how The Godfather begins? How could it have begun? You remember that the first scene is Don Vito's conversation with the undertaker Bonacera. Now, most scenes in a film begin with what is called an establishing shot, in which the whole scene is given, with all the participants established in clear spatial relationship to one another, before the camera homes in on details. Thus, this film could have begun with a shot that shows us the whole room, the table, and all the actors from slightly off to the side. This beginning would emphasize the unity that holds the participants together, and it would be a clear unity. The camera could have stayed in the same position, say about head height, for 7 minutes. It could have been a head height so that we could find ourselves on an equality with all the participants. Or it could have been lower to the ground, looking up, as with a film by the Japanese director Ozu, whose camera usually watches the scene from the point of view of someone seated on the floor in meditation. So already these two positions of static camera would convey a very different effect. Or the camera, after the establishing shot, could have just cut rapidly from face to face. Or it could have just stayed on the face of Don Vito Corleone the whole time and watched his reaction while a voice talked off screen. Or we could have the camera moving in a circle around the table as the opening dialogue takes place. This emphasized more of a yoking together of all the participants. If the camera moves faster in a circle, we would have a feeling of excitement, dynamism, vertigo, and the movement would draw attention to itself as equally important as the dialogue. Or, I remember seeing this in a Brian De Palma film, maybe The Untouchables it was, we could begin with a bird's eye view from the ceiling above the table, suggesting a perspective greater than that of any of the human participants. And if the camera rotates and swirls around as it closes in, then there would be a feeling of danger as well as coming to earth. So the possibilities are infinite, yet the director has to commit to one. So how does the film actually begin? So what we're going to do is we're going to watch maybe the first 7 minutes again, and I want you to pay attention to when exactly the cuts happen. Okay, as it is, I'm going to talk only about the first cut. Okay, so we'll watch.
He took her for a drive
It was on pause
with
for too
another
long.
boy.
Let me back it up a bit. This is the hardest part of putting this talk together, is mastering the technology.
I believe in America. America has made my fortune. And I raised my daughter in the American fashion. I gave her freedom, but I taught her never to dishonor her family. She found a boyfriend, not an Italian. She went to the movies with him. She stayed out late. I didn't protest. 2 months ago, he took her for a drive with another boyfriend. They made her drink whiskey. And then they tried to take advantage of her. She resisted. She kept her honor. So they beat her like an animal. When I went to the hospital, her nose was broken. Her jaw was shattered, held together by wire. She couldn't even weep because of the pain. But I wept. Why did I weep? She was the light of my life. Beautiful girl. Now she will never be beautiful again. Sorry. I went to the police like a good American. These two boys were brought to trial. The judge sentenced them to 3 years in prison and suspended the sentence. Suspended the sentence? They went free that very day. I stood in the courtroom like a fool. And those two bastards, they smiled at me. Then I said to my wife, for justice, we must go to Don Corleone.
Why did you go to the police? Why didn't you come to me first?
What do you want of me? Tell me anything, but do what I beg you to do.
What is that? That I cannot do.
I'll give you anything you ask.
We've known each other many years, but this is the first time you ever came to me for counsel, for help. I can't remember the last time that you invited me to your house for a cup of coffee. Even though my wife is godmother to your only child. But let's be frank, you never wanted my friendship. And you were afraid to be in my debt.
I didn't want to get into trouble.
I understand. You found paradise in America. You had a good trade, made a good living. Police protected you, and there were courts of law. And you didn't need a friend like me. But now you come to me and you say, Don Corleone, give me justice. But you don't ask with respect. You don't offer friendship. You don't even think to call me Godfather. Instead, you come into my house on the day my daughter's to be married and you ask me to do murder. Money.
I ask you for justice.
That is not justice. Your daughter is still alive.
Let them suffer then, as she suffers. How much shall I pay you?
Buonasera. Buonasera. What have I ever done to make you treat me so disrespectfully? If you'd come to me in friendship, then the scum that ruined your daughter would be suffering this very day. And if by chance an honest man like yourself should make enemies, then he would become my enemies. And then they would fear you.
Be my friend? Godfather?
Good. Someday, and that day may never come, I'll call upon you to do a service for me. But until that day, accept this justice as a gift on my daughter's wedding day.
Grazie, Godfather.
Prego. Give this to Clemenza. I want reliable people, people that aren't going to be carried away. I mean, we're not murderers, in spite of what this undertaker said.
That's it. Yeah. Okay, this it's an audacious and astonishing opening. You notice that the first 3 minutes, right up to the point when just after Bonacera whispers in his ear and then moves back out of frame, that's the first cut. Right? So I'm going to talk about this first shot. So a shot, for those of you who don't know, is like the basic unit of a film. It's the bit of film between two cuts. Right? So a film is composed of shots that are then stuck together. Okay? So I'm going to talk about this first 3-minute shot. It's very audacious. So what do you see here? So first, there's black screen for a long time. 10 seconds of black screen, that's a long time. And then the trumpet starts playing a solemn, melancholic, almost funereal waltz. And it's a lovely tune, somewhat Italian, a little bit operatic. Okay, the single trumpet expressing, to me, solitude and sadness. While a waltz usually expresses community, at least of two dance partners, and perhaps celebration, this waltz is a waltz of loss and loneliness. Why does Coppola choose to start the film with this music played over a black screen? It acts as a kind of frame. It sets the mood for the whole film. Introspective loneliness, yet dignified and majestic. In a way, it's the waltz of a defeated warrior. We already know from this opening, from this black screen, that this is not going to be a happy movie. And in spite of all the emphasis on family and community throughout the film, this trumpet opening, which tells you that what stands at the core of this film is actually a proud solitude and sadness. And all this in the first few seconds. And then we see Paramount Pictures, and then black screen again, and then the famous image, the puppeteer's hand over the word father. Right? The strings are over the word father, which at first we might take to be describing the all-controlling hand of the Godfather. But then, you think about it, on repeated viewings, we might wonder who or what is really the puppeteer here, and that is the father that's caught in the strings. Right? So this father, this Godfather type, even though he seems to be the person with most power, the one controlling, might actually be the one controlled, the one least free, kind of most determined by the mechanisms of his situation. Because this image itself is this iconic image of the Godfather, the words the Godfather, very powerful. Now after the title, there's black screen again, the trumpet goes on, and then the trumpet stops, and then still with black screen, you hear the voice saying, "I believe in America." Okay, and then the light comes on slowly. Right? So this is so daring. And so what then ensues is an extraordinary shot, one of the most extraordinary shots in the history of American cinema, which is a slow 3-minute zoom, right back, starting from a man's face, extreme close-up, starting from a man's face, and then ending about 5 feet away, looking at the man from over the shoulder of another man. So most of my talk is going to be devoted to the complex effect of this shot as an opening. Now, there's been no establishing shot. Right? That is the shot of the whole room, giving us the spatial relation of everyone to each other. So in conventional grammar of filmmaking, every scene should start with an establishing shot. Not to have an establishing shot, it's a little bit like starting an essay with the word "and" or in the middle of a phrase. Okay, so it's startling. And what this means is that in the effect of the film, when the light goes on, it says we don't know where we are, we don't even know when we are. You know, we have the vaguest idea, we're probably in America, but that's all we get of the situation. Okay, so then we see the man's face. And so for the next minute, all you see is practically the face and then the top part of his body. And let's think about the look of this shot. The man's face, as he talks into the camera, could be from any time period. The old-fashioned collar seems to me not of the 20th century. And people have remarked about this film that every frame looks like a Velázquez or some other painting. It's a very painterly film. And there are other frames, some of the American city frames, you know, they look like an Edward Hopper painting or something, like some of the storefronts and the restaurant fronts. I mean, these is very painterly. Now, this particular shot, the look of this, it's got high contrasts between very black-seeming black, right, and very white-seeming white. Very high contrast here. And there are also rich reds and golds, like the facial tones, rich. You know? And to me, it feels like an oil painting by Rembrandt or some 17th century Italian artist, some portrait painter. And the man's posture towards the camera also suggests this, gives this feel of 17th century portraiture. It doesn't feel 20th century to me. If I turned off the sound and you just watch this, you know, it could seem like anywhere in that, you know, something European, something old world, oil painterly. So pictorially, the feeling is very different than the world of the mid-20th century. Maybe some Renaissance feudal aristocracy, it's somewhere in Rome, somewhere between Machiavelli and Stendhal's Charterhouse of Parma. You know, some world where nothing has changed much in the power relationships. Indeed, as the camera pulls slowly back, the first thing that we see that indicates a specific historical period is the telephone, bottom right of the screen. Apart from the telephone, we're in another world. Now, what of the man himself, Bonacera the Undertaker? If, for the first minute, before we become aware of the presence of others, we just watch his body, and for the meanwhile, pay scant attention to his words, we notice immediately the burning eyes, the fervid facial motions. There's a tightness around his nose, right? These are expressions that, again, they don't feel to me like the 20th century, whereas the James Caan's Sonny in this film feels very 20th century, you know, kind of so laid back, you know, individualistic. This guy Bonacera just feels like a different world, a more dramatic world. So you have the face, you have this body, very passionate, very intense. And where are we? What kind of situation? So from the first minute, as he's talking, say, well, you think, is this a court of law? Right, where a man is earnestly defending himself from judgment or presenting some kind of judgment of others? Or is it a confession? It could be a confessional. A church, is that where he is? A church? A man standing up before God? Or could it be a man in the privacy of his own dark room performing to himself in a mirror? Right? Perfecting his self-presentation to a world that's going to give or deny him honor. Without more context, until the telephone and the other man appear, it could be any of these, or even all of these, some peculiar compound. Now, obviously, this man Bonacera has gone over these thoughts hundreds of times in his mind already, and the sentences are formed. But I wept. Why did I weep? You know, he speaks like that as if he's practiced this. And in his body language alone, we see manly pride, desire for vengeance, veiled contempt for the gangster that he feels himself driven to seek. There's a hint of self-abasement at the confession of his own impotence. There's fear of the Don, and also a kind of instinctive respect. This is a man who spent his life hoping to be an American and wishing to walk away from what he sees as the old oppressive culture in a society where he can make himself and not be dependent on the strong men, the human dispensers of violence. But now he finds himself pulled back into the world of his fathers and finds that it is a world that he does not understand. This is why pictorially these first few minutes have to feel like another world, the dark past, one ruled by Borgias and Medicis, and not by impersonal governmental structures that regard all men as equal. Standing here, Bonacera is a complex of emotions: helplessness, violated manhood, shamed fatherhood, a man unable to protect his daughter, hatred of the old culture, together with hatred of himself for needing it, betrayal by his chosen society. It's all there in his face and how he tells the story. The actorliness of this performance, it's a wonderful performance, but this kind of actorly quality about it. The words well chosen, the sentences with perfectly timed emphasis, show his desire to convince the Don and also convince himself that he is a good Sicilian with good ancestral values. He's playing his ethnic identity, albeit sincerely playing. This is a man who has lost faith in America and has gone over to its underworld. So the film starts in the moment of darkness. I believe in America. When we know he's gone away from that. I believe in America. And there's kind of but hidden there. Meaning that I actually no longer believe in America, which is why I have come to you. Or I've come to you even though I desperately want to believe in America. Right? So what is it? I believe in America, when the whole thing seems contradicted by what he's doing. So these words are uttered in darkness because they're uttered by a man who's no longer sure where he is. Now this man is allowed to speak for 2 minutes. Only later do we understand that his interlocutor is the kind of man who listens and thinks more than he speaks, and who is content to sit back and let others manifest themselves. Bonacera speaking for 2 minutes is testimony to his interlocutor's power. When the camera has pulled back as far as it will go, half the screen is now occupied by the shoulder, ear, and hand of the other man. His presence dwarfs Bonacera's in terms of sheer amount of space on the screen, and the facelessness of the image also suggests power and timelessness. Now this relationship, it's of client to patron in the old Mediterranean order. It's a deathless relationship. It doesn't really matter which human individuals are filling these roles. The Don's first words, "Why did you go to the police? Why didn't you come to me first?" nails the essence of the situation with precision. It's a question about the fundamental allegiance to different world orders. This one or that one, but you can't have both. And Bonacera chose. It is a question that he doesn't answer, but that the Don, as he admits a few minutes later, already knows the answer to. Bonacera didn't want the old order, and is only coming to it now because his sense of violated manhood sees no other recourse. Now there's a daring moment in the shot when, you'll remember this, Bonacera leaves the frame. So in a normal film, the camera might follow him, but he leaves the frame, he disappears, you see the empty chair, and he comes around the other side and he whispers into Don Vito's ear. So this is towards the end of this shot. The camera stays still the whole time. He goes in and out of the frame, as if, again, the setup is immobile and central, the desk symbolizing maybe the client-patron relationship, while the human participants in this relationship move in and out, somehow dispensable. Or else, it is the Don that is the immovable center of power, and the movement has to occur around him. The Bonaceras of this world are interchangeable. It is only after the whisper that the shot changes. But it's significant. But is it significant that our 3-minute shot has culminated in something that we can't hear, this whisper, something that is relegated to silence, be it out of fear or shame? To Bonacera, this moment of inaudibility concealment. He must feel to him like a deal with the devil, some deal that cannot see the light of day, that cannot meet other human ears. Now, in this first shot, the tone of his speech is interesting. It's haughty, demanding, and it gets more haughty and demanding after this shot, especially when he offers payment. This reveals a further rift. Notice no one else speaks to the Godfather in this way, right? This shows that Bonacera is not an old Sicilian, and he doesn't know how to behave in this underworld, which is why he has to posture like an old Sicilian and mouth the ancient shibboleths like she kept her honor. And I'm not sure he really believes in those things. So he's really someone who's trying to be a new American and trying to think like one. And his sorry reality is that he can now neither be American nor Sicilian. He's a man with no world. And when he leaves one of those worlds that he doesn't really have, the only place for him to go is a kind of underworld. Now, he tries to make a contract with the Don. I'll pay you. How much shall I give you? And the response is a kind of disgusted, saddened look, right? And he's coming from a bourgeois society that's expecting a murder contract. You do this and I will pay you for it, and then we're done. What Bonacera doesn't understand is that the old world that he just entered doesn't follow bourgeois rules, but is aristocratic and feudal. It's not about contracts, which are finite, but about vows, which are infinite. So even when he kisses the Don's hand, I believe that he doesn't fully realize that he's making a pledge unto death. Endless fealty to his lord. And at the end of this film, it is the same feudal pledge that Kay witnesses through the door. Right? The same door into the underworld. Right? It's no coincidence that of all the things that the director could have chosen to be behind Bonacera, it's the closed door, the secret entrance to this dark world, to pass through which Bonacera must have spent many agonized nights of inner turmoil. Now, why would a director have chosen to make, as the first shot of this film, a slow zoom away from Bonacera's face? It's as if this man is held before us to be scrutinized for truthfulness and loyalty. We, like the Don, have to know who Bonacera really is. And he is the focus of the first 3 minutes, because he is a man who has just undergone a crisis of loyalty, the dissolution of faith in his society. He could be any of us who loses faith. And yet, he is also one who clutches desperately onto a fossil of ethnic identity that can symbolize for him the possibility of refuge in an unsafe world. Originally, Francis Ford Coppola considered opening the film with a wedding. But a friend convinced him to start it with something like the Meditation on America that begins another film that he wrote, Patton, which you might have seen. If he had started with a wedding, we would have begun in the world of daylight officialdom where everything is bright and healthy, and then only later ventured into this dark, aberrant underworld. But starting from the temporal and spatial uncertainty of Don Vito's court or confessional, we begin the film instead as denizens of an older world that thinks it has the right to judge the newer world as lacking. Because we start here in Don Vito's study, and this is why the 3-minute shot ends by looking over Don Vito's shoulder, because we, aligned with him, are judging Bonacera. So because of this, we are set up to feel no revulsion at, say, the murder of a policeman or the string of assassinations at the end of the film. Conflicted, like Bonacera, we have become the Don's subjects. Now, Bonacera is important also because he is a microcosm of what I consider the film's central conundrum. It would be a mistake to interpret the film as simply about America versus Sicily, or new values versus old values, and so on. What Bonacera is suffering from is rather a fantasy of America versus a fantasy of Sicily. In reality, he understands neither place, which is why he doesn't know how to behave in either place. And he's at home in neither place. This opening shot, this kind of lack of homeness, is the key to the soul of Michael Corleone as well. He too is not Sicilian, not American, but someone caught between two fantasies. perhaps as every American is. In some of the key moments of violence in this film, we see fantasy landscapes disfigured by violence. When Sonny is killed, the camera lingers on an Edward Hopper-like pastoral cornfield with a bloodied car in the foreground. And similarly in Michael's Too Good to Be True Sicilian Idyll, which sometimes looks like a 19th century French or Italian painting with peasants in a field, something that's shattered by a car bomb. A superficial reading might claim that while the ethnic allegiances are fantasy, only the violence is real, and that's why it feels somehow cleansing. But on the other hand, might the violence not stem from the fantasies? We can think about that. Now, if I may be permitted a final Johnny digression, this film, which feels so Shakespearean, is actually a version of Shakespeare's Henry IV plays, with Don Vito as the usurper Bolingbroke and Michael Corleone as young Prince Hal, who has come into his own in the world his father created. As an interpretation of the Henry IV plays, the Godfather films have helped me to see more clearly that the plays are not really about the shift from old to new, but rather expose competing fantasies about England that culminate in Henry V's establishing of a new fantasy. Reread them and see if you agree. So I'm going to stop here, knowing that even in this first scene, I have not talked about many things, such as the cat, the rose, Marlon Brando's performance, all of them inspired. But I hope that I have shown that a slow reflection on one remarkable shot is as rewarding as careful study of a speech in Shakespeare. In every great film, as in every book, the whole can be seen in every part, if you know how to look. And every scene of this film will also reward intense study. I chose to look at one shot, and so the relation between shots did not come into question. Mr. Carl is going to guide us in thinking about that. So do you have anything to add?
I have a lot to add, but maybe we should wait for the question period.
Okay, go, yeah.
So writing the paper was a challenge, but not as difficult as what I'm going to try and do now, which is play the movie while I'm speaking and pause at certain moments in the next 7-minute scene so that I'm speaking and playing at the same time. I'm not sure how successful I'll be at choreographing that. The image here is where I'd like to start. This is 1 hour, 1 minute, and 39 seconds into the movie. In just a moment, Michael will stand outside the hospital where his wounded father lies. 7 minutes later, he stands outside the same hospital and lights a cigarette for Enzo the baker. In the course of those 7 minutes, everything has changed in the life of Michael Corleone. I want to move slowly through this hospital scene, lingering on a few specific images that provide us with visual cues to this transformation, and say a few things about the techniques Coppola employs to create what I consider to be the scene of maximum dramatic tension and suspense in the movie. It is significant that this moment of maximum drama is also the moment of transformation for the movie's main character. As we watch the hospital scene together, let me also point out that at one level, nothing really happens in this scene. Instead, the action is devoted to avoiding what could happen, or what will happen if Michael doesn't take firm and decisive steps to prevent it. We might say that the action in the hospital scene is internal rather than external. The action takes place within Michael and within us as viewers and interpreters of this internal action. For other than brief interactions with a nurse who remains virtually faceless throughout the scene, with his speechless father lying in bed, and with the civilian baker Enzo, about whom we heard, but who we did not meet in the scene in the Don's office during Conning's wedding, Michael plays this scene largely alone. Throughout the hospital scene, there is no actual violence, though the end of the scene is punctuated by the violent moment when Captain McCluskey, brilliantly played by Sterling Hayden, breaks Michael's jaw. Coppola creates the moment of greatest suspense in the movie through suggestion and possibility rather than through direct action. In comparison, the scenes in which Luca Brasi is garroted, Don Vito is gunned down in the street, Michael shoots Soloso and McCluskey, Carlo beats his wife Connie, Sonny beats his brother-in-law Carlo, and Michael's hitmen eliminate the enemies of the Corleone family at the end of the film are all more intense action sequences. But they lack the suspense and excitement of the hospital scene created by the tension of the possible as opposed to the actual. As I said, the hospital scene begins at 1 hour, 1 minute, 39 seconds, and ends 7 minutes later. It consists of a total of 72 cuts and shots. Walter Murch, who was a close friend of Coppola's during the shooting of The Godfather and worked as the editor and sound editor on several of his movies, said this about editing Coppola's other masterpiece, Apocalypse Now. So this is a quote from Murch. "At the end of it all, when the film was safely in the theaters, I sat down and figured out the total number of days that we, the editors, had worked, divided that number by the number of cuts that were in the finished product, and came up with the rate of cuts per editor per day, which turned out to be 1.4. Granted, Murch's example from Apocalypse Now is offered as one extreme of the editing process. If Murch's average held true for this particular scene in The Godfather, it would mean that an experienced editor working 8 hours a day would have needed 7 weeks to edit the hospital scene. That's a minute of film per week. Averaged over the entire movie, that would mean it would have taken 3.5 years to edit the entire 3-hour movie. Obviously, The Godfather's editing process moved somewhat more quickly than that, but these numbers help us to realize that each of the 72 shots that comprise the hospital scene is part of a carefully choreographed and well thought out vision of the effects of the scene that the scene is intended to achieve. Some cuts, this first one here, last nearly 30 seconds, others last only an instant, but every one of them has been constructed to lend to the overall impact of the scene as a whole. In my reading of the hospital scene that follows, I want to particularly emphasize the importance of editing and the effect of these cuts. So starting here with the hospital entryway, notice the archway framed by feeble but colorful Christmas lights, which will offer virtually the only color in the movie for the next 7 minutes. The facade may remind literary viewers of the arch under which Dante passes as he enters hell, which bears the warning, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." And for Michael, this scene does represent the end of one particular kind of hope. I'm going to see if I can get it to play. Jeez. If you leave it on pause for too long, it skips. With this computer, it would take 20 minutes. So let this play in the background while I continue speaking. Of the 72 shots that comprise the hospital scene, the initial view of the archway, framed by the twinkling Christmas lights, is the longest of the 28 seconds. Longest at 28 seconds. The scene opens with a view of this archway, allows a taxi, which you just saw, to pull into frame and deposit Michael into the scene without cutting, and ends with Michael moving toward the building he is about to enter. The camera angle makes Michael look small in comparison to the looming, ominous archway and staircase he is about to climb. Small and virtually lost in shadow, Michael approaches the staircase. 7 minutes later, when Michael is again on the stairs, the camera angle is shifted and medium close-up shots are used so that Michael looks larger and more significant. I think we linger for a full 28 seconds on that shot to build suspense, which the music in the soundtrack emphasizes, and also because it is beautifully composed. The use of light, shadow, color, and camera angle create a beautiful image of a threatening facade that Michael must penetrate as a first step in his own journey toward becoming the Godfather. The archway serves as a frame through which Michael will pass and, in the course of a few minutes, be transformed, entering into a stage of his life that his status as a war hero and that his relationship with the non-Italian Kay suggested he might have been able to escape. But his passage through this eerily lit archway into the hospital is also a passage into a life that neither he nor his father had ever wanted or expected him to take. The first cut is of an empty hospital hallway, which I'll return to in a few moments. Throughout the hospital scene, empty hallways are used to create tension and suspense. Some of these shots only last a few seconds, but they have significant dramatic effect. As with the shot of the entryway of the hospital, the shot of the hospital hallway starts with a fixed view of a stationary location into which motion is introduced by means of a side entrance. In the first shot that we just saw, the arrival of a taxi. In the second shot, Michael, who enters the hospital. The taxi's entrance is from the left of the screen. Michael's entrance balances this motion by coming from the right. These establishing shots first introduce the audience to the setting and then allow action to move into the frame that has already been established by the stationary camera. Let me just replay that 10-second clip if I can. So here's how he comes in. When I watch movies, I'm particularly interested in walls and doorways. Doorways, of course, are obviously important. They are both passageways for entry and exit of characters in a scene, and they are also excellent frames for action. Just as the movie screen, here, hold on one moment, listen to this. I have a question about what that sound is later on. Doors further highlight a specific image or action that appears on the screen. The most famous example of this in The Godfather, and one of the most famous in the history of cinema, is the final image in the film, during which the door slowly closes between Kay and Michael as he is receiving the loyalty of his new mafia retainers who kiss his hand and address him for the first time as Don Corleone. This closing door in the final scene of the movie is more than just a symbol. It is also a physical portrayal of one of the main themes of the film, the gulf between the personal and business that grows wider and wider over the course of the film as the old way of doing business is gradually overwhelmed by a new way, which threatens the family values that underlay the criminal empire under Vito's control. In contrast, Michael speaks of my business when talking to Kay, whereas Vito always spoke of, quote, the family business. Because doors are on hinges, they are not stationary frames, but swinging ones, which open, as in the scene in the hospital when Michael opens the door to his father's room that we're about to see, or close, as in the final scene with Michael and Kay. In order to build tension and suspense, or introduce a sense of possibility or finality, one might say that the door Michael opens in the hospital to reveal his father, whom he must first help and eventually replace, finally closes in the final scene of the movie when Michael's transformation from civilian to Godfather is complete. So here's the moment where he opens the door. I'm suggesting that this door closes at the end of the movie. Once Michael enters the hospital, we have a series of shots which we've just seen. Some of them are stationary, such as the medium close-up of the half-eaten sandwich, which suggests a hasty departure, and some are tracking shots, such as of Michael's movement through the hallways, that start to build up this dramatic tension. A realization is dawning on Michael, as it is on us, the audience, that all is not right here. What started out as a routine visit to the hospital has transformed into a crucial moment. This realization is marked first by a close-up of Michael's face, in which Pacino's eyes and mouth express signs of concern. This is immediately followed by a cut and a shot of Michael running. In all of these shots, the camera remains stationary, which means that characters move forward or away from it, coming in and out of focus and obscuring the camera's line of vision with parts of their body. There's a good example of that here with the nurse's appearance. The camera doesn't cut. The music is creating tension. Oh, it does cut. It doesn't cut.
What are
there,
you doing
right
here?
there where her
You're
head
not supposed to be here.
explodes in a burst of light. Until this point, the hospital scene has been silent except for the soundtrack and ambient noises. And that was that weird repeated tonight that we heard. Mr. McDonald thinks that might be a skipping record, which is possible, but there's no visual cue of a record to convince me that that's the only way to interpret that sound. The first spoken lines by a minor character in the movie are a question and a statement. We just heard it. What are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here, the nurse says. Her comment is more right than she realizes. Michael is not supposed to be here. He has tried to stay free of the family business, but the pull of family, and perhaps of business as well, is more powerful than he knew. In response to the nurse's question, he must assert an identity, which is military uniform during the wedding, and his relationship with Kay, obviously strained in the hotel scene immediately preceding the hospital scene, has tried to deny. I am Michael Corleone, he says, as if acknowledging it for the first time. This is my father.
Here now.
As Michael,
Michael
I'm going to turn this down a little bit. As Michael and the nurse are moving Vito's bed, the soundtrack introduces the sound of Enzo's footsteps. Waiting for the person who these footsteps precede, we see, and we'll see this in just a moment, a striking close-up of Michael's face. The right side is obscured by another door frame, as if to suggest the dual nature of the character who is being faced with a life-changing decision, a decision which will gradually lead to the eclipse of the right side of his character as the left, the sinister side, comes forward. In literature, the left side is the side of Satan, and we are reminded of Satan in all his works, which Michael claims to denounce during the baptism scene at the end of the movie, at the very moment when it is most apparent. This shot of the left half of Michael's face is followed by a gorgeously composed shot of an empty hospital corridor, which we have already seen. There's nothing unusual about this shot, which is precisely what makes it so striking. Let me fast forward a little bit, see if I can get to these two shots. So you can hear the footsteps. Here's the shot of the half of his face. And now here's the hospital. This is the same shot as at the beginning of the scene. This shot feels so real, perhaps because it is not a set, but an actual hospital. But somehow, it strikes me as a hospital scene with the added intensity created by its being a scene in a movie, a hospital corridor as we have never seen it before. It has become, due to the dramatic tension of the film, almost hyper-real, and we as viewers have been brought to a heightened sense of observational awareness. We are looking at the corridor of a hospital we might never bother to notice if we actually found ourselves waiting there for a doctor or a sick friend. As an object of dramatic and aesthetic contemplation, the film doesn't merely ask us to look at this hallway, but educates us in the art of seeing as well, training us to become more observant and better seers of what we are watching, and by extension, of the world around us. Now the cuts start to come more quickly, building dramatic tension and culminating in the shadowy figure of Enzo's back as it emerges from the staircase, his arm cocked and hand concealed as if holding a weapon. He is dressed in the long black coat and hat we've come to think of as the gangster's uniform in the movie, as opposed, for example, to the military uniform worn by Michael earlier in the film, or the tasteless civilian garb of characters like Fredo, Carlo, and Mo Green. But the next cut we see...
I am Enzo, the baker. You remember me? Enzo. Yes, Enzo. You better get out.
The next cut, which we just saw, we see the innocent face of Enzo carrying not a gun, but a bouquet of flowers for the injured Don. Enzo has come to show his respect and to express his gratitude for the Don's help in resolving his emigration problems. And here Michael repeats the nurse's question from a minute ago. Who are you? It seems that the hospital scene is intent on confronting Michael with this central question of identity. Who is Michael, and how will he come to realize who he really is? Enzo's offer to stay and help if there's going to be trouble. Let's see, I think you can say it here.
Hey, Enzo, there's going to be trouble. If there is trouble, I stay here to help you. For your father, for your father. All right, listen.
This for your father, which he repeats, is the first sign of loyalty to Michael that we see symbolized by the kissing of his hand at the end of the film. Michael's ensuing dialogue or monologue with his speechless father, in which he states, "I'm with you now, I'm with you," brings a tear to his father's eye, which in the context of this scene looks like a tear of paternal love for a son he thought had grown away from him. But by the end of the film, especially in light of a later scene in which Vito confesses his aspirations for Michael, that he might have become a judge or a senator, and in that scene he refers to wanting Michael to be the one who pulled the strings, who was the puppeteer from the image that Krishnan referred to earlier. Makes us realize that this may also be a tear of sorrow for the fact that his favorite son was unable to resist the pull of the family business and make a new life for himself in America, just as the dreams of Bonacera, the undertaker, and the possibilities of America were also dashed by the rape and beating of his daughter. I guess she wasn't raped. He says she kept her honor. and the impotence of an American justice system in the face of this crime. Now, toward the end of the scene, we have this beautiful shot of Enzo's face, waiting on the steps outside the hospital for Michael. Michael exits through the archway he passed through only 6 minutes earlier, 6 minutes which, whether he knows it or not, have completely changed his entire life. Now the colors of the Christmas lights are complemented by the color of the flowers Enzo carries. Flowers of gratitude for the Godfather's favors and protection, but also flowers which may remind us, because of the link between Enzo and Bonacera the Undertaker in the first scene of the movie, of something ominous and funereal. Strangely, they don't seem out of place in this dark, shadow-filled scene. But in terms of Michael's personal journey, they have no place, and he has to throw them away. Flowers will have no place in the new world Michael is preparing to take up residency in. The transformation of Michael is given vivid expression in a famous scene that we're about to see, when Michael lights Enzo's cigarette and notices without surprise or elation, but rather with a kind of detached observational objectivity, the steadiness of his hands. It is as if Michael is realizing, despite years of attempting to deny it to both himself and those around him, who and what he is. The steady hands are a sign of this internal identity, brought forth by the crisis threatening his father's life that he has just faced and overcome. Perhaps Enzo is framed so beautifully in the shot that I was just paused on, because he is a final image of the life that Michael could have had but rejects, partly out of love of his father and partly to fulfill a destiny he was born to and could not avoid. Earlier, I referred to Enzo as a civilian. This is how other characters refer to Michael, despite the fact that he first appears in the movie in military uniform. Here's the cigarette. Enzo can't light it because his hands are shaking so badly. So other characters refer to him as a civilian, but they are wrong, and the uniform is right. By the end of the hospital scene, Michael is no longer a civilian, if he ever really was one in his heart. Now he is, quote, with his father and forever separated from the world of bakers and undertakers, represented by the beautifully shot Enzo standing alone on the hospital steps. Enzo represents the world that Michael can exploit or protect. He can do or extract favors for or from, but it is not a world that he will occupy. Finally, we have that dramatic climax in the hospital scene with Michael and Enzo here on the staircase. Michael reaches into his coat for a gun that isn't there in order to scare off the hitmen who have come to kill his father. Here, too, we have a moment of suggestion rather than actual violence. Michael scares off the men with his confidence, with the threat of violence rather than the act. At the end of the scene at 108:18, the hospital scene ends with the smoke of Enzo's cigarette partially obscuring Michael's face, as if to again emphasize the internal transformation with external visual cues. In concluding this discussion, I would like to address briefly a general question. In many ways, as we will hear from Mr. McDonald, The Godfather is a violent movie and also a movie about violence. But is there not another kind of violence done to the movie itself by the viewer who engages in the type of analysis I've been doing here? What about the hermeneutic violence performed on the film by the critic? We have lingered over details that would be almost invisible to an audience watching the movie as it was intended to be experienced in the theater without the luxury of a pause button and the high resolution of a DVD or Blu-ray. There is a sense in which this kind of analysis performs an act of violence on the film, tearing apart and looking in isolation at images which were intended to be seen as part of a smoothly flowing whole. But there is another sense in which this kind of artificial viewing attempts to recreate, in order to more deeply understand and appreciate, the acts of creation which gave birth to the film as a work of art in the first place. When we recall what Walter Murch said about averaging 1.47 cuts a day while editing Apocalypse Now, and then think about the 72 cuts that comprise the 7 minutes of the hospital scene, we can appreciate the painstaking care and attention that goes into creating each scene in a great movie. a care and attention that both warrants and demands our own thoughtfulness and reflection at their most attentive. When we watch a movie, we discover the same truth we encounter when we read a great work of literature or philosophy. There is a great pleasure in the having of an idea, and it is in the service of this pleasure of ideas that we perform such acts of analysis and interpretation. Where would you like me to cue you up?
44 minutes, more or less.
Okay.
But I won't actually start that until I've talked for a while.
All right.
So I'm going to talk about violence, not as a glorification or celebration of violence, but in an effort to understand what it's doing in this film, or why a film should depict violence as extensively as this one does. And I'm also going to talk a bit about citrus fruit, which I think you'll be persuaded is prominent in the film, and I think ends up being a kind of emblem of violence. I'm not going to talk so much about what the violence accomplishes in the plot, or why these particular characters are so violent, but what the artistic depiction of violence does. I began to be interested in this some years back. I watched the Godfather films from Coppola, and some Tarantino films, and Sergio Leone films, and some other brutal films that I've forgotten. And I was fascinated by the way violence was somehow given a lyrical depiction in these films. Really horrific things were being done to people, and somehow it seemed beautiful, or if not beautiful, somehow elevated and aesthetically rich. But the violence was not being treated flippantly as if it had no consequences. These directors took the violence seriously. They knew that the tearing of human flesh, the shedding of blood, this is no light or meaningless business. And some of these directors treat those things sometimes with some degree of humor, but they never pretend that the acts aren't terrible. So what does it mean to aestheticize violence? That's one of the questions I'd like to take up today. But I can't take it on directly. We're going to start somewhere else. I'd like to start by talking about the notion of lyricism. I said that the lyrical quality was what had struck me about the violence in many of these films. I think it's certainly present in The Godfather. And I think I'd go so far as to say it's a quintessential cinematic quality, one of the prominent aspects of film generally. But to characterize lyricism, I'm going to have to back up and talk about experience as a general kind of thing. Why? Because I want to assert that film and experience operate according to the same principles, and that film can be understood as a mode of experience, intensified and highly coherent experience. So ordinary experience, our observations about it, can help us come up with some useful ways of thinking about film. So I was trying to find some way to come up with principles for talking about film. Is there any way we can get rid of that image? It's too violent for me. I wanted to find a way I wanted to come up with general principles, and the resemblance of film with experience seemed to me a place to go in order to find a way to talk about film. And hopefully what follows will help you to be somewhat persuaded with that assertion that this is an important resemblance. So first I would want to ask, what is experience? I'd say that it's encounter or contact. We have such encounter or contact through the senses, of course, but that's only a small part of experience for most of us. The larger part, to some extent stimulated and occasioned by experience through the senses, is our inward experience, our encounter with ourselves, with our feelings, notions, yearnings, imaginings, fears, and hopes. And inasmuch as we experience these things and further respond to ourselves, the inward experience has a kind of reverberative quality, a sort of continuous tone or timbre. And there's a feeling of continuity and self-consistency about it. When our experience has this feeling of continuity or coherence, we have the sense that we inhabit a world rather than being accosted by fragments, little scraps from within and without. And I think this feeling of having a world, of having coherence in experience, is basically a matter of affect. It's on the level of feeling that it presents itself to us. So experience, which involves encounter with what's at least nominally outside us and with our own inner lives, is held together most of the time not by the thought of unity, not by some principled assertion, but by a feeling of unity. And when that sense of unity is prominent for you, you see everything as somehow cohering. Many of us strive for such a sense of things and have it to some extent much of the time. And when we seem to lose it entirely, it's a very dangerous condition. Now notice what it's like when that feeling of coherence in the life of affect is especially strong. You'll notice that your aesthetic sense is also heightened. You'll notice that things seem to have special aesthetic power. Often you'll be struck by the beauty or at least the aesthetic order of what's around you. So affective coherence, I want to say, brings with it aesthetic coherence. You might say even that aesthetic coherence is the mark of the primary affective unity. So I was trying to find something that seemed to me to hold experience together, and I'm going to go on to argue that it in some sense also holds film together, given that film is a kind of experience. And it seems to me in my own life that it's indeed on the level of affect that things hold together. And I might just be an excessively heartsy type, but I think this is probably true for most of us. So let me mention a few things that might support this idea that aesthetics and affect go together. Here's one. You'll notice that if there's a person you're engaged with affectively, if you feel affectionate toward him or her, then you tend to notice more beauty in that person than you might otherwise. And to put it the other way around, someone of striking personal beauty will tend to engage your affections very readily. So there's a kind of mutual relation, a sort of reciprocating, ratcheting effect that happens between your affective response and your aesthetic response to a person. Here's another instance. Suppose you are a homemaker, someone who embellishes and beautifies a home. I think you're using aesthetic measures to both reflect and foster the atmosphere of affect that you have. You've got a certain affective tone, a feeling tone with regard to your dwelling and your family, and you fulfill that feeling tone in making your dwelling a beautiful place to be. And as you inhabit that beautiful and pleasing place, you find your affections bolstered and sustained through that beauty. One more support of this connection. When we call a beautiful person or thing lovely, we're indicating that indeed that beauty induces affect or love, or that in our experience of that person or thing, the beauty we see and our affectionate response, the loveliness and our love of the loveliness, these go together. Only in pathological cases, it would seem to me, are affect and aesthetics separate. So it's implied in what I've said so far that coherent affect brings on aesthetic coherence and that it operates in the other direction too. Aesthetic coherence or power can bring affective coherence. In fact, as far as I can tell, the life of affect and the aesthetic life operate together and are often simultaneous, though the affective aspect may be more primary. And as I've said, we notice certain periods of experience in which the aesthetic and affective qualities are heightened. And the sense of coherence or unity is important here. It's at these times that our sense of the unity and coherence of the world is especially strong. Now, the ability to see the world whole is crucial for us. We cannot thrive without it, nor can we even function very well without it. Most of us have enough of this most of the time to do pretty well. But my sense is that if you don't feel you inhabit something coherent, it's very difficult to function even in the most basic way, and certainly more largely in the life of inquiry. You have to be able to assert that there is a world. You have to be able to assert that things hold together. Otherwise, there's really nothing to understand except for little isolated bits. And again, my sense is that sense that things cohere and that there is a world to understand and a world to inhabit and a world amenable to you, that's something I think you that is available to you primarily on the level of feeling. It's not an abstract notion. It's found in experience and in affect. But sometimes the coherence is heightened, and it's that kind of heightened experience that is transmitted through art. So I want to say that art generally is experience of this kind, that has the coherence and where the aesthetic and the affective, both of those aspects are prominent and united. And you've probably noticed this, that a work of art can give you an experience of a cohesive world, similar to the experience of special cohesiveness you've had once in a while in your life more generally. Now, when this sense of heightened affect and heightened aesthetic intensity, when these two are present together and it leads to a strong relishing of the details of experience, to a kind of tender infatuation with the particularities of things, as if to celebrate the thusness of it all, this is what I want to call lyricism. And I think the kind of the sort of the attention to detail that that Mr. Carl and Mr. Venkatesh they've brought your attention to these details, and I think what they're doing is helping you see the relishing that you are doing without full awareness when you see a film like this. So there's a way in which the kind of the sort of the extremely precise coordination of detail in the film is a consequence of the coherence that's there artistically. So there's lyricism in ordinary experience and lyricism in film, but film can provide it to us perhaps a little more reliably than we might find it otherwise, since ordinary experience is a fickle business. We pursue this sense of unity, I think, all the time in everyday experience, but it sometimes eludes us. But a work of art can provide it to us in a way that's usually a little more dependable. Now, you'll notice that something like the feeling of unity we find in the lyrical mode seems to be aimed at by systematic thinking in the philosophical and theological traditions. A lot of careful systematizing has been done in order to be able to assert on the level of principle that there is a world and that it holds together, has an order and coherence to it. But I want to suggest that on the level of experience, such systems of doctrine don't help us much when we're faced with a severe disruption in our world of feeling. In other words, things happen which shatter even the subtle and often unacknowledged sense of unity we possess. We have some basic feeling of that unity most of the time, even if it's not very vivid, and we rely on this for thriving. But when you encounter something unassimilable in experience, an act of violence, for example, or some terrible trauma, your world is lost to you in the sense that you no longer feel a world. You no longer apprehend it. You no longer apprehend in your heart that there is a cosmos somehow held together. But this is what art can provide some assurance about, and it can do so on the level of experience, which is where the problem is encountered to begin with. This is not to say that in the moment of shattering grief, watching a great movie will be a comfort. It may not. But over time, our sense of the coherence of the world can be damaged or eroded through suffering. And art can be a token of a lost unity, a reminder of what it feels like to see an intact world. So art may be a kind of medicine for us. That's not to reduce it to a mere therapeutic instrument. I'm only trying to say something about why some of us find it such an urgent and important thing. There are surely other arguments for its importance and other quite different claims about what it's up to. But this is one account. So when violence is rendered lyrically in cinema, when it can be contained in this way and shown within a unified aesthetic and affective experience, it amounts to a kind of containment or framing of an aspect of human experience which is otherwise extremely difficult for us to be reconciled with. An aspect of human experience which no amount of systematic cognition seems to address at a fundamental enough level. I want to say also that religion has gradually absconded from the realm of lived experience for many in the West, and this too has made art feel more necessary. I'll speak more about religion soon. We have that sequence late in the film where a baptism and a series of killings are presented together, and I do want to speak more about our broader situation with regard to religion. But right now I'd like to point to a prominent scene of violence in the film where it seems to me that lyricism is present, a strongly felt unity of experience. This is the scene in which Vito Corleone is shot in the street while buying fruit. He's buying oranges. So that's at about 44.
I think I'm there. Let's see if it works.
Okay.
Aspetta, Fredo.
You get to see it backwards first, then you can see it forward. A little bit more. That's not something we can do. Can the control panel do that?
I think it's this light.
You want to turn that light? Is there even someone back there? You turn that light off, that might help. Yes, no?
So once we've worked out how to show the clip, we'll just watch this short clip. It's about 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes, and then we'll find a way to pause on one of the stills near the end of it, and then I'll continue.
I think we just crashed the computer.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I can just describe the scene. I've already.
I'll reboot it and you
Okay.
keep
Yeah.
going.
I'll just proceed. Yeah, you'll find this verbal description is nearly equivalent. Okay. Yeah, we're going to do a complete version of the film in prose. So the scene begins with Vito stepping out in the street while Fredo waits by the car. In the background, the orange flames of a fire are emerging from a steel drum near a fruit stand, and the water on the pavement makes the pavement very dark. The darkness of the pavement has a visual echo in the blackness of the Cadillac, which Fredo stands near. Vito tells Fredo to wait for a moment while he buys some fruit. Fredo says in a childlike way, "Okay, Pa," and gets into the car. At this moment, the sonic background is the sound of someone practicing on a horn, similar in timbre to the horn which plays the Godfather theme at important times throughout the film. But this horn playing is disjointed and tuneless, therefore appropriate to a scene in which the Godfather himself will nearly die. As Vito Corleone approaches the fruit stand, we can see that the color of the flames in the metal drum resembles the color of some of the fruit in the baskets. We hear the horn still playing and the crackling of the fire, and in the distance, a dog barking. Vito selects 2 oranges and a bell pepper, and perhaps something else. Wow. That's a scene of terrible desolation.
Yeah, none of us watched the film carefully enough.
Yeah, I never noticed this. I mean, they say every time you watch it, you notice new details.
I'm working on it.
Okay. Yeah, so Vito picks out some fruit. 2 men approach, and as Vito notices them, we see their legs moving on the pavement. The camera follows their legs, and their legs moving on pavement, is precisely the kind of detail we would notice in an especially consequential moment. Or at least when we recollect that time later. The camera moves to the guns in their hands, and then to Vito stumbling over a basket of oranges as he dashes toward the Cadillac. We hear him cry out as he stumbles. We are now looking down on the scene from above. The oranges have been strewn across the glistening black pavement. Small bursts of fire emerge from the guns in imitation of the fire in the steel drum. We hear the gunshots, and Vito hits the hood of the car. The oranges continue to roll, spreading out toward Corleone, flame-like, as the men continue to fire. The camera is now looking across the scene from one of the earlier points of view, as the men still shoot and Fredo gets out of the car. We now see Fredo from the front as he fumbles with his gun. Yeah.
I'll find it.
Okay. So Fredo fumbles his gun, he drops it. He's a clumsy fellow. The men run away, and we see Fredo against a background of 2 orange-like discs behind him. Vito is now slowly tumbling off the hood of the car, a process which takes about 15 seconds. This slowness fits with the way we remember such an event afterwards. An event of great intensity and horror resides in our memory in just this way. Okay, looks like we're just about there. So I'm going to pause and let the clip run.
It's right about 44, you said?
I thought so on the version I was using. It's right after this, I think. Yeah, there we go. I was using. It's right after this, I think. Yeah, there we go.
Aspetta, Fredo. I'm going to buy some fruit.
Okay, Pa.
Merry Christmas. I want some fruit, then.
Okay.
So I was talking about the way that the Vito Corleone character sort of tumbles off the car and how slow it is, and my sense there is that the slowness is very much how such moments of great intensity strike us. If you remember some experience you had that was very powerful, retrospectively at least, and sometimes in the moment, it has that kind of feeling to it. Other films might use the artifice of slow motion for this effect. Here, Marlon Brando simply plays the descent to the ground very slowly and savoringly. This is the quality of relishing which typifies the lyrical mode. As he hits the ground and continues to roll a little, we hear the dog barking again, and an infant cries out somewhere. Now we hear the Godfather theme, and Fredo begins to weep and bawl, as if the infant in the distance had given the first indication of just what the proper reaction here was. Fredo is childlike here, ineffectual, unable to use the gun, and like a little boy in relation to his father. As the scene closes, he shouts hoarsely, "Papa." Fredo's appearance throughout the scene as a vulnerable and powerless child deeply reliant on his father helps to unify the affect of the scene. Also, the tender everydayness of the act of buying fruit reinforces this feeling too. Meanwhile, there's aesthetic unity through the orangeness of flames, the orangeness of oranges, the blackness of car and pavement, as well as the balanced visual composition of every shot. Now, as you've noticed, I haven't provided a rigorous argument for the coordination of affect and aesthetics. But I would appeal to your own experience and ask, have you not had some moment which felt unified in just this manner? And do you not find such experiences again in art? So now I need to talk more about the oranges. Some of you know that these are famous oranges. They show up, I've been told, in the television series The Sopranos. There's a reference there. And I've seen them in Breaking Bad. And if you watch The Godfather carefully, you'll see that oranges are conspicuous throughout the film. They're on table centerpieces. Characters toss them in the air. If you just watch for oranges, you'll see lots. Which is that's the only way I ever watch the film. So I've already suggested that they resemble the muzzle flashes during the shooting of Vito Corleone and resemble the fire in the steel drum near the fruit stand. I'm seizing on the image of the oranges because I would like to shift to another view of violence, and the oranges seem to me an emblem of violence in this other sense. I've said that the lyrical mode, this unified mode of experience, is part of what art can provide for us, and that this can be a kind of reassurance or a signpost toward recovering a world, an experientially coherent place fit for human habitation. But the uncontainment of the oranges, their spilling out, their disorder, this points towards something else. And I think the second sense of violence that I'm about to address may connect to violence the way that Mr. Venkatesh was talking about it, where these characters are stuck between imagined worlds, and the violence seems to be the only thing that feels real. I think the violence in this second sense is somehow, I think, akin to what he's been talking about there. So for a very long time in the aesthetic tradition in the West, there's been discussion of what some have called the sublime. Some speak of it as the aesthetic experience produced by terror, where the threat is remote enough that the terror can produce delight. And I think that's a good description of the sublime in some of its presentations. But I think excessiveness, uncontainability, being faced with the unassimilable, these might be better ways of describing how the sense of the sublime is produced for this discussion. And this other sense of uncontainment is supported, I think, by the traditional accounts of the sublime too. A familiar example of the sublime in this locale here in New Mexico is an immense bank of cloud. You've seen this, a roiling, billowing body of cloud of great vastness and height, of great brilliance and darkness intermingled. Its scale is so grand that you can't really get hold of it visually. And the unruliness of it as a visual experience leaves you unable to find any way to fit it into a simple aesthetic order. It exceeds your usual aesthetic experience, and you have a sense of awe in your encounter with it. Another example, the sunset, as we sometimes have it here in Santa Fe. Because the excessiveness, the vastness, and incomprehensibility of these experiences is what makes them what they are, photographing them is usually a mistake. Once they are made small and contained through being pictured, they are merely picturesque. And they are then usually neither beautiful, as containable things can be, nor sublime. So I'm asking you to please stop photographing sunsets, because it shows that you've misunderstood the sublime. It's a dead giveaway. So the sublime can't be pictured, really. I mean, we can be presented with it visually, but I think that the act of picturing makes it something else. It doesn't remain itself when we try to put it into an aesthetic order, but there are other levels on which the sublime reaches us, besides that of the visual immensity and excess that I spoke of in connection with cloud banks and sunsets. There's what I might call the visceral sublime. This is the feeling of excess, of too muchness, on being faced with violence. It's that gut-level sense of shock and horror when you suddenly see a human body being torn or punctured, and when you see blood flowing, when you see a gross violation of the integrity of the human body. This is the uncontainment of the oranges, which in their starkness are like blood, and which spread chaotically and without any clear order. This brings us to that sequence near the end of the film, which I'm not going to show, but you remember it clearly, in which Michael Corleone is standing godfather to his nephew, and we see shots of this solemn and religious event interspersed with shots of Michael's enemies being gunned down. This doesn't seem to me primarily an ironic juxtaposition. There may be some irony here, but I think the stronger aspect of it is the sense that somehow the church ceremony and the killings are in accord. And I don't mean this disrespectfully to the religious side of it. I'll explain what I mean about there being an accord. So there are little ceremonial details in the preparation for the shootings shown right beside the ceremony of baptism, which help to accomplish the conflation of the violence and the religion. For example, the donning of armor and weapons and the shaving before going out to kill, these are treated with ceremonial care. And the wiping off by one of the gunmen of a smudge from the side of the car as he sets off, this too shows a kind of ceremonial precision and care, similar to what you see in the church in the same film sequence. Now, when you see human bodies being broken and perforated, as you see in this sequence, there's an almost physiological overwhelm, the sense that this is too much. You have a kind of visceral reaction, more revulsion than terror, and which is deeper than any mere moral sense you might have with regard to the violence. It's a natural reaction, you might say. I don't think it has to do with received morality or what you might have learned from your parents about what ought and ought not to happen. It's deeper than that. I'm arguing it's physiological. And when you have that natural reaction, I'm arguing it brings on a feeling of the sublime, the excessiveness of it and the almost physiological overload that you feel. And it's a feeling akin to religious awe. That's why the blending of the baptism scene with the scenes of vengeful killing is not entirely ironic, but instead somehow apt. In the Catholic religious tradition, there is a good deal of imagery depicting terrible physical suffering, violence, and death. Much of it is epitomized in the traditional image of Christ on the cross, usually portrayed sculpturally as punctured, bleeding, tormented. You'll notice that Coppola and the other directors I mentioned earlier have at least a strong cultural acquaintance with the Catholic tradition generally. They grew up Catholic, I think all of them, or at least they grew up strongly acquainted with the Catholic cultural milieu. So that tradition itself juxtaposes, that tradition that they grew up with juxtaposes the visceral sublime that I've been talking about, such as you might see in the image of Christ on the cross, with what it understands to be authentic transcendence. And so it seems to me understandable that one one of those things could come to stand for the other. And in fact, that the visceral sublime, this sense of being, this reaction we have when presented with violence, could come to stand in for something like religious awe. This is especially so in the modern era, when religion is less and less present as a factor in experience. I mean, no longer part of what serves to constitute experience for us. We still yearn for this sense of awe, the sense of being presented with something beyond us, too much for us. We want something that's too much, because the ordinary world is often so dull. It really is. And cinematic violence can provide us this. So this particular way of depicting violence in the movies, this way you see in this film and in some other films of the last 40 years or so, this is a reflection of where we stand with regard to the religious tradition. We seek some of the experience associated with religion, but many of us feel we cannot find it in religion itself. So this becomes, so reading this film in this way becomes a way of thinking about where we stand with regard to metaphysics and the religious tradition. So I should add that this tendency of presenting the sublime through violence goes all the way from Caravaggio to Cormac McCarthy. So I think it's really throughout the modern era, and especially associated with Catholicism. It's in the artistic tradition from the Renaissance until now. Flannery O'Connor also has this kind of depiction of violence. I think it's in the same line. All these names are associated in one way or another with the Catholic tradition. And this same era, Renaissance until now, the era of modernity, is one where religion recedes from the center of life as lived, and some stand-in, some surrogate is sought. I can point to things outside the arts, too, that reflect this sort of chasing after the sublime. The cult of the outdoors, in which we seek a feeling of transcendence or sublimity through encounter with wilderness. The interest in extreme sports, in which great and extraordinary dangers and exertions are sought after. Even the interest in very spicy food, there's a sort of hot sauce cult, and extremely hoppy beer. These all reflect a desire to meet with something that's too much for us, that we might have something like ecstasy. So I'm going to try to wrap things up to whatever extent a discussion about the uncontainable can be wrapped up. So you might wonder if you've sort of been following this whole thing in the two different modes I've been talking about, the lyrical and the ecstatic mode associated with sublimity. You might wonder how those two modes can be reconciled. Because one has to do with containment or unity, the sense of having a world, something that holds together. And the other has to do with uncontainment, or being pushed out of the ordinary by being presented with something that itself just can't be comprehended. So my preliminary response would be, I don't know quite how, but I think they can both be present in the same work of art, perhaps even in a single moment of that art. How this is made possible? It's perhaps that the visual and affective ordering in which violence can seem to be comprehended operates on a different level than that of the visceral sublime. So like when he's tumbling off the hood of the car, there's a kind of visual and aesthetic coherence to that. It holds together on that level, while at the same time you might be pushed into some kind of sublime sense just through your sort of natural reaction to what's happening. So multiple levels at once in terms of the effect that the film has on you. But sometimes also in my consideration of these things, it seems to me that the lyrical and ecstatic modes are the same thing seen differently. And perhaps that's somehow true. So now I'm going to back up. I'm nearly done, so hang in there. I want to back up and think about the title of this event. The title of this event referred to film as a liberal art. Let me say a few words about that to close. It seems to me that one of the deepest aims of our practice of the liberal arts is to learn how to inhabit our world as fully and as honestly as possible. That means putting aside the various conventional notions of things and trying to come to terms with what is. I really do think that's what we're up to, is trying to face what is on whatever level. So not just on the level of trying to come up with an abstract sense of things that's true, but also being honest to our own experience. That means putting aside the various conventional notions of things and trying to come to terms with what is. And that's going to involve trying to see the world whole, because if you see only fragments, you don't really see. And furthermore, there's nothing to comprehend if you see only fragments. And some of us, we need that experiential wholeness because at some point we begin to lose our sense of having a world, and we seek to regain it. And others of us, we have that sense of a world but need to learn to embrace it and explore it more comprehendingly. Art, including the art of cinema, is a way to go about that, attentively, relishingly, bringing to our own lives and our own studies something of the sense of savoring and delight that the camera brings to what it sees with such care. And as I hope I've shown here, it also gives us the opportunity to think more broadly about the human experience. For example, about our yearning for ecstasy and where things stand in the tradition at present, such that we would seek it in new places. Thank you. So I think we're gonna take a break.
Yeah, actually, oh, thank you.